So I'm going to talk about consumer-driven contract testing. So let me set the scene a little bit for this presentation, and probably most of us are. This is actually not really specific to Go. In particular, it's more of a pattern. I want to set that front, but there are Go libraries to help you build this testing framework and suite. But most of us probably heard of microservice architecture and evolutionary architecture. Microservice architecture is just a subset of the evolutionary architecture, but really what this comes down to is, and I may be able to give a high-level overview and catch people up so we're all talking about the same thing and seeing maybe some of the same problems that come with developing a microservice architecture. But I'm going to start actually with the bottom. Evolutionary architecture is about building a system that can evolve as what we call fitness functions start to change. So fitness function in evolutionary architecture are things like, well, they're all your abilities, your scalability, your availability. You kind of choose certain attributes that you're really important to your product or your system, and you build metrics around there, and you're constantly monitoring these metrics as you change the architecture and make sure you're within a certain fitness function of those. And you only really change the architecture when you start to see that you're not performing well in one of the abilities. But it's all about setting up your architecture such that you can evolve as the demands on your system evolve and not have to go through an architecture rewrite. And microservice architecture is one way of kind of building out an evolutionary architecture. Small modular systems and services that are loosely coupled, independently scalable, isolated change management, that helps build evolutionary architecture, but you also come in with the cons. In a microservice architecture, those that have built them, there's some increased complexity in the inter-service communications and orchestrations. There's issues with partial failures in a monolith application. If this thing goes down, the whole thing goes down. What do you do in a microservice architecture when half the services go down, and how does the system behave in that way? And then testing, I've seen in my personal experience with microservice architecture is trying to, your holistic test suite you have to start changing your thought processes and your paradigms. And especially if you want to maintain loosely coupled systems and independent deployability, testing becomes a little more difficult, a little more challenging in a microservice architecture. And so with that kind of the stage, you have these services, you have all these things, it reminds me of several Dilberts and other things that kind of come into play. You don't have to read all of it, but in essence, there's a lot of just talk and big words. We walk out going, well, those are all nice sounding things, but it is the journey in the end that's the fun part of these architectures. So what could possibly go wrong? If you build microservice architecture, you're set, right? No more problems. No, I'm afraid in my experience, it has not been that case. Certain things that do get easier, but there's other things that get more difficult. Graceful degradation, right? You have this comic actually hits it up. Like, how do you stay away from creating a distributed monolith? Too often I've seen companies build distributed monoliths and call it microservices. Distributed tracing, being able to, it becomes more important and more difficult to do in some cases, and having every service be able to follow the path and see where problems occur and where there might be latencies or bottlenecks to the architecture. This is one that I've seen is circuit break and retry policies. It's really easy if you don't have some things in place to DDoS yourself. And I've seen that also way too much in microservice architecture and having retry policies and not correct circuit breakers in place. And then the last one that I'm going to kind of really highlight in this conversation today is contracts. As you build up microservices, the interfaces you build between services and outside of services become an area of brittleness and can be an area of brittleness. Having teams be able to change their contracts without impacting other teams. There's lots of methods, and we'll talk about those, but it's an area that can create real problems and stifle growth and innovation if you don't set up how you're going to deal with contracts appropriately. So that's where consumer contract tests come in. What are the challenges of contracts, right? Versioning. I will be honest, I'm not a big fan of versioning, only because we always talk about deprecating old versions. Does it really ever happen? That's really hit and miss. Most companies I've been a part of it's really hard to remove a version and to deprecate it, especially if you're exposing that to customers. And so you end up just adding on to your updates more and more and more, and having maintained backwards compatibility and everything else that just, if I get away from not versioning, I'm going to choose that path every time. Now there are necessary evils in that, and I recognize them, and I'm not saying we don't version, but if I can avoid it, I try to avoid versioning. Most of the time, the challenges of contracts is it's a runtime failure. Your team goes and changes the contract on their service, the interface into their service, and they don't know that it's going to fail until they deploy it, and all of a sudden, your whole system goes down because something that you said was going to be true no longer was true. They're difficult to test. This is an interesting one. I think most of the time what I mean by difficult to test is that you can set up your own unit tests and integration tests locally, but that only covers the provider side. That's only covering what I know and not necessarily what my consumers know and are doing. And this will lead into our next couple slides. And then the cost of change is with contracts can be high, meaning that one of the things is, do you know all of your consumers? And if you don't know all of your consumers, trying to figure out who's consuming you and who's using what, and versioning and all that stuff, the infrastructure, the development time, it's to change a contract can cost a lot. So oftentimes you don't, or you try to not change the contract because it's of the difficulty testing, runtime failures, cost of change. So these are kind of the challenges that come in with the interfaces into services. And this is where consumer-driven contracts are hoping to help alleviate some of that pain. So when we talk about consumer-driven contracts, let's start with the provider side. We're used to these. Like provider contracts, we have these all over the place. We have API documentation, Swagger, proto files, XML schemas. These are things providers, as a service I'm writing and building, and that's my contract that consumers can look at and say, this is what's available to me. Consumer contracts kind of build on top of that. They are kind of, what I'm speaking about here is really the pattern. It's not any implementation, but consumer contracts is about expectations. And how we communicate that, it can be done in many different ways, and we'll talk about one way here through a library, but in the end, consumer contracts is what they are consuming actually from your service. And so really what the benefit of consumer-driven contracts comes into or provides is an expressed assertion of the provider's contract that deliver business value. So a lot of words, in essence, what it really means is as a consumer can tell the provider what I am consuming, that is business value. The provider's contract does not really define business value. Consumption is actually where business value is achieved. And so a consumer-driven contract can really teach you about what about your service is providing business value by what I'm asserting from the provider's contract.
So does it keep like a central catalog of all your consumers then? So you would know exactly how all of them are consuming it?
Yeah, so it does not, the actual,
I'm jumping to implementation, sorry.
right, well, that's fine, yeah, the pattern actually doesn't specify how that's done, but that is the purpose of these, is the collection of them. Now you can aggregate them and union them and see what actually do our consumers really need from my service, and what are they really using. And that's an important part of any API ecosystem. I'll put my disclaimer, my disclaimer, well, not disclaimer, but my plea for consumers of APIs: only use what you need to use from an API. I've seen too often consumers create data models where they bind to every single field that comes from an API when they only need a couple, they're actually only using a couple of them.
Just in case.
Just in case. And matter of fact, we saw this at Route just a couple days ago where we had an external consumer bind to a field, and unfortunately our provider contract was wrong in how that field was being delivered. And so all of a sudden they started seeing it and they started having their production code break. And after talking to them, well, are you guys using that field? Well, no. Please just not use it then, or take it out. Like, not that we have things we need to fix. I'm not taking fault, but as consumers, I plead with you to, through your providers, don't bind to everything within an API. Because why? It breaks this assertion, right? Like, now I can't tell, and you can't tell, what actually do you need from my API? And that will come into play. We talk about some of the benefits, but so any questions about the pattern so far? And if you have questions online, just put them in the chat and I can answer them there. Yeah.
This seems very driven towards what they use of what's available, as opposed to like evolving from what they're asking for. Is that correct? Like there's kind of a separate process for like evolving new stuff they want?
Right.
Okay.
Typically, additions to APIs are kind of non-breaking changes, and then that's true, but this definitely is on the side of what are they using from the provider contract.
It feels like almost some sort of inverse relationship to the SRE idea of any exhibited behavior will be depended on. Like, this makes me think like the important behaviors are the ones that are used, right? Like, it's sort of what you're saying, like,
Right.
what people are actually doing out of this, and that's what we need to maintain.
Right.
You're doing that, like, oh, people are depending on these behaviors that we exhibit, so.
Right.
Yeah, our experience is that's why we are very clear about the limited subset of our API that is available to customers, because once we add a field, we can never remove it, because good luck convincing a customer to update the code that they wrote 5 years ago after hiring an independent contractor.
And I should clarify, this pattern does have a scope, an intended use. Like, if you're talking about internal teams, it's really easy. Your GitHub, with the GitHub's API, there's no way you're going to have this type of pattern built with all the consumers that you have. So if you have a known set of, and I say known, it doesn't have to be all known, but there is a known set of consumers, this pattern really helps in letting you manipulate your contract in a much more safe and easier way.
And you guys, are you using this at Route right now?
We have some teams using it. It's not widely used, and we haven't implemented it fully.
And is your intent though you're saying for your scope, you're going to use it for all your internal teams mostly?
Mostly that's where we'll start. I don't know that we would it would be nice to do it with our consumers, and we might, because I think we have a fairly limited set of external consumers, but we haven't gotten to that point yet.
That's going to be great for internal, because then if you you're tracking all your consumers, you'll know what you can't break,
Right.
what you can't change.
Yeah, there's only a few projects right now. We're kind of prototyping it and evangelizing it, but we're at the beginning of it, that journey. So, the pattern benefits, I want to start with the limitations. Like we just talked about, limited to a closed community. You kind of have to know, it's not really it's not a good pattern for an open and unknown community. If you have a limited and closed community, it's really great. It does not guarantee that breaking changes will not happen. It can still occur. You can still create breaking changes, but and it does not necessarily reduce coupling of services together. That is, it's not meant for that kind of stuff. What's meant for,
Tracks the coupling.
it can track the coupling, right? So I think, what it's meant for is about anticipating the effect of the evolving system, right? You can now say, if we make this change, here is who is going to impact. It documents and exposes those couplings, and we'll talk about how this might happen more organically and even hidden ones through some of the implementations that are out there. They tie evolution to business value. So now, if we go back to what is business value, what is being consumed from your API, now you can look and say, well, this is stuff that can't change, and here's stuff that can, and here's stuff that can improve, and really you tie your evolution of your architecture and your API to business value and not necessarily to an unknown consumption. And it provides a faster feedback about how changes impact business value. So if you have a set of definitions of what consumers are expecting, you now can look at your change and see that before you deploy, rather than deploying and seeing, oh, there was someone using that, sorry, we'll roll back, kind of situation. So it creates a really fast feedback for both the consumer and the provider. And this all comes from, I will say that this all comes from, Martin Fowler's has an article, actually written by a different gentleman, created it. It is on, I think it's still an adopt phase of the ThoughtWorks, I forget the name of it, ThoughtWorks technology radar. I don't know if any of you follow that, but there's things being adopted by quite a few, and they're recommending this pattern within your organization. So one implementation I want to talk about, this is probably the most popular implementation of consumer-driven contracts. If you go to docs.pact.io, they have libraries in almost every language you can think of how to implement this. But in reality, I want to talk about what it does. So what happens is, what is our fastest place of feedback is really in our unit testing. Like if you wait till integration or till system testings or till staging and user acceptance testing, stuff like that, it can take a long time to get feedback. So it's really driven around unit tests. So what they have is a library for the consumer to use that through your unit tests, you write, and as it goes through, you're exercising your code, and you exercise an endpoint, it will take that endpoint and build a contract that is then put into a shared space. It could be a 3-bucket, it could be a database. There's lots of plugins for this, but it's, in essence, they have like a server that shares these contracts. And so anytime this changes what they're using, it updates the contract of how they're using that API. So it's built right into the test case. In essence, the first time they run this, they build the contract, and after that, it actually you can use it to create a mock server of that contract, which is great, because when you talk about coupling, one of the other patterns I see a lot of is, I need a staging environment to test my app locally. And now you can create mock servers with this contract and not necessarily depend on a running stage environment to run your unit tests as a consumer, thus making a faster feedback cycle. And so that contract is shared. The provider then, during their testing, can pull down those contracts that are built from many different consumers, and they basically run those contracts against their own service to make sure that they comply with what the consumer is expecting, and get feedback as soon as they are out of compliance. There, like I said, there's many ways. They have a broker that's what it's called, the server. They have a broker that you can upload contracts to and share contracts that way. You can have contracts put into source code, and I mean, it doesn't really matter how you share those contracts, but
That is what you're using?
this is what we're using.
Is it mostly focused on REST APIs?
It's mostly right now focused on REST APIs. I have not looked very much into gRPC and how it would play there. gRPC is an interesting one. I want to see why you couldn't do something similar, but
I tried to use Pact and Weave a couple years ago, but we were almost all gRPC. It didn't quite work back then.
yeah.
gRPC kind of has an implicit contract, but it's not as cool as.
Right, but gRPC, well, yeah, and it's still, gRPC even still like has the same problems of, sure, I have a contract of all the things, but really what is actually being used?
Yeah.
I think that's the benefit of this consumer driven is really the business value aspect, what is being consumed, because what does this mean, right? Like, if no consumer is using a property that's in your API contract, and they're being honest, and that's the other thing is, let's be honest, but then I don't have to version. I can just remove that line without versioning, don't have to maintain that version. The other examples are, maybe there's some field in your API that's really expensive and no one's using it. Like it's doing some aggregation on the database, and so it's an expensive data point to call, no one's using it. Well, why spend compute cycles computing that property? You can reduce the costs. Without necessarily having to have everyone jump to the new version for it, you just remove it. So you go back to what we're trying to do. It reduces when you version. It doesn't get rid of versioning, but it reduces when you would need a version, reduces cost. It creates a simple way to test these contracts. And I can't remember what the other one was, but yes.
Similar question. Do you know if there's anything around like event-driven? That's actually what I thought this was mostly about. It's cooler, it's even cooler than I thought, because it, extends to other things.
So I have not looked. I believe if you go to docs.pact.io, they do have some libraries now for the event-driven contracts. If I remember seeing correctly, I thought I saw something on there about that, and they've come a long way. If you looked at it a few years ago, even for me, like I haven't looked at it in a couple of years until starting at Route, and they've come a long way.
It does seem to have messaging built into the idea instead of just like HTTP stuff.
Right. So,
Eric, they did give some talks about event-driven. Well, they didn't give talks about it. They mentioned it in some of the QCon talks. So if you wait until February and those are released to the public, then you can watch the talks that I'm referring to, where they talked about the contract testing and using it across basically all of the API gateway spectrum, from your HTTP to even event-driven contracts.
Cool, thanks.
I didn't think about event-driven, but that's could really apply there. Because at least gRPC is request reply in most instances, right?
Right.
And it's very clear what I'm getting back. But if someone's just producing events,
Right.
lots of times there isn't a very clear contract method, right?
Yeah.
Even it's just documentation. So it could be really beneficial there to say, I'm consuming these events. If you're gonna change them, I need to know.
Well, and especially for event driven, right? If it's like, I'm always calling for some expensive
Yeah.
thing, cause I write that data point, let me produce it once and
Yeah.
add it, you know, kind of Todd's point about what do I want? What would add a lot of value to be inside of this event?
Any other questions? And unfortunately, I will admit, I was gonna put some code samples together, but with our AWS outage today.
Is that still going? CF wasn't working.
Yeah.
I was like trying to get onto the meetup page, it's like, it's still down. Is it still down?
They say they're recovering stuff service by service now.
Ouch.
So the root cause is resolved with service by service.
DNS?
Route, get your stuff out of East 1, just get it out.
You have a, yeah, you have.
We already did some questions, so if there are any other questions about Pact and consumer-driven contract.
I mean, this seems very similar to just the normal concept of like user experience tracking, like front end or UI stuff that you would normally do, except like stuff I actually care about. So,
We applied to technology, applied to APIs.
yeah, exactly. And you can do it internal or external, as long as you can track, well, it seems interesting because I think that this only actually matters if they can optionally request fields, or you're tracking like URLs and such. Like the event streaming is a really interesting one, just because like I will see what somebody cares about for consuming an event, but if they consume the whole thing every time, I don't know what fields they care about.
Right.
But like it's an interesting possibility if like you're like using GraphQL or something. What fields do people actually request? Because if the others are there in the request, then I don't know. But if you're using GraphQL, you can literally say, I only want these 3. And so there's a lot of potential around all of this for gRPC, for GraphQL, for all the things. And it's getting my mind spinning now.
I do like the idea of this is operationalizing the thing you've experienced sometimes where you're working on something, you're like, oh man, I need to do X, and it's really hard for me to do this thing in the code, and then someone who really knows it comes along and says, oh, nobody calls it, like, we don't even need that. And you're like, well, why am I even, like, I like the idea of that you can just kind of like point to data and say, this isn't used, it's not worth maintaining, or, you know, like it allows you to hard evidence, and you don't need that person that's like super knowledgeable who can just say like, why we don't even bother with that anymore.
So I think it definitely formalizes kind of the underlying principles of really the API world, whether it's event-driven, HTTP, whatever it is, the API world is having a good community, not just as providers providing data, but as consumers, right? Like, I often think as consumers, we get a little greedy sometimes in how we consume data, and it'd be nice for a good ecosystem about being minimalist in what we consume. That's allowing the provider to be able to evolve and change without some of the overhead of changing contracts. And so this just formalizes a way in which we can communicate that and then create automated systems to validate and verify and create confidence and change, which is really what we're trying to get to, right? Everything we want to do, we want to create confidence that a change is going to work and not constantly rolling back.
I also really like that there's not a difference in workflow between like internal consumers and external consumers. Like they're the same. Really adds to the architecture. We have teams that like, everything is really tightly coupled. So.
It should be.
As it should be. So it's not even distributed monolith, it's like the distributed like worst version of a monolith that we've all encountered. But when you like really enforce like separated contracts, the first question is like, well, how am I gonna update so-and-so's service when I need blah, blah, blah? And it's like, you already do this. You can't go to Stripe and say like, I need to change your code. You make a request and pray that they care.
And Stripe does backwards compatibility for like 10 years or whatever, like
Yeah.
it is forever.
Yeah.
It's so nuts.
So it just depends on like where you want to invest and how you communicate and really just makes it like, this internal group is not special. You still have to do the work. I do like this whole thinking.
Yeah, your customers aren't always the people that give you money. A lot of times they're the other developers in your organization or.
Don't let my CEO hear you say that.
So they're not just.
Yeah, I know.
Multiple stakeholders.
Yeah.
That's all I have. Thank you.
If I can chime in real quick.
Yeah.
I never do.
Never.
Just, you're talking about like data minimalism is kind of making me rethink. Historically, I've gone the other way. It's like, you're diving in, you're understanding whatever weirdness is about whatever API you're doing. You're like, oh, well, here's 7 undocumented fields that came back in the JSON. Right, you end up doing all the investigative work to say, here's what it actually is because the documentation is so terrible. And so then I end up making the full struct and not just, because when I'm starting, I don't know what I care about. Like, and I don't know how to, so if there was good documentation, right, then it's less important.
Yeah, it's an ecosystem, right? Both provider and consumer need to be good partners in that ecosystem. Documentation is important. But, I think that we, as consumers, we have to be careful with what as well, or not necessarily careful, but be cautious about what we're consuming, and because there are effects that can provide to providers, and especially internally, like we don't have to. It can be very expensive for the whole company to deal with being greedy or kind of unfiltered consumption.
Also feels like it's the opposite of GraphQL, which makes me happy. It's like, nah.
Nope. It's say exactly what you want beforehand.
Yeah, because
SQL queries on the
it
fly.
lets you evolve in a systematic way, not
Yeah.
right back on that, whatever, where you had the limitations first. That was my first thought was GraphQL is if you have unlimited external consumers that are going to consume forever, like a Facebook or a GitHub, where it's like someone is using every field.
Yeah, you have no idea how they're all using it, because there's so many of them.
But for the majority of people, where it's just an internal back end to front end or whatever.
It's a good way to communicate and have. My biggest thing, right, is really comes down to is for my teams, I want to create confidence that changes can be made independently and without fear of problems. And this is one way to help strengthen that confidence, not guarantee, but strengthen the confidence that change isn't going to create a set one incident that we have to jump into and fix.
Seems like it would also be easy to, where you start canarying out like, oh, I'm about to remove a field, but I'm gonna, just remove it right before I marshal it out 10% of the time or 50% of the time.
Well, and that brings up a great point, right? Like now, I mean, what it really is to do is to facilitate conversation. It's now I know who of my consumers are using that field. And if it's really expensive, I can converse with you and say, hey, do you really, really need that field? Is that something really important to you? If not, what can we do to remove the necessity of that? And thus I don't need to, once again, version and take on the cost of that.
Derek does aggressive API versioning, like 10% of the time you're gonna get version 2, but 90% version 1.
No, just like removing fields.
Yeah. Canary testing a change. That changes a tweak to your contract, a silent tweak.
It's like, why did this fail 10% of the time? I don't know. Really
That feels
weird.
just not there. It's
Really
there
weird.
now. Well, thank you. Yeah. Okay, well, again, big thanks to Route for coming down and providing pizza and for providing 2 speakers and feel free to stop the recording, but feel free to everyone stay around and chat and talk about whatever.
One of my kids has pooped their pants.
Everyone online, I'm sorry.